The box was the size of a shoebox, and it weighed almost nothing. I found it on a Tuesday in March, pushed to the back of my mother's closet shelf behind a winter coat she hadn't worn since 2009. The coat still smelled like her, powder and something synthetic, the floral spray she ordered in bulk from a discontinued catalog line because the thought of running out of it troubled her in a way she could never fully explain. I moved the coat aside. I reached for the box. It was fireproof metal, painted gray, the kind sold at any hardware store for $40. It had a combination lock on the front, 3 digits. I turned the first dial without thinking, then the second, then the third. My birthday, March 3rd, 0303. The lock opened. I knew before I touched the dial. The way you know a pot is boiling before you cross the room to check it. The way a body knows things the mind hasn't caught up to yet. Inside was a single manila envelope, unsealed, the flap folded over and held down by a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. My name was written on the front. Not typed, written, in handwriting I did not recognize. I would recognize it later. I would come to know it the way you come to know the handwriting of someone who loved you before they knew you. The document inside was 12 pages long. The heading on page 1 said, Petition for Adoption, Final Decree. Below that, a court seal. A county I had never lived in. A date, March 14th, 1993. 3 weeks after I was born. My name on the document was not the name I had carried my whole life. It was something else. 4 syllables. A name my biological mother had chosen before she let me go, and that I had been living inside of, unknowing, like a room with a door that was never shown to me. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories. If you are new here, we share stories about families, the things that get kept, and the quiet moments that change the shape of everything. Drop a comment and hit subscribe, because this story is only starting. My mother Carol raised me in a gray Cape Cod on Birchfield Lane in a small Pennsylvania town where the summers smelled like cut grass and the winters smelled like wood smoke, and the years had a particular sameness that felt, at the time, like stability. I understand now it was a kind of deliberate construction. She was organized the way people are organized when organization is a form of control. The pantry was labeled in her looping handwriting: pasta, rice, canned tomatoes, all labels facing out. The bills were filed by month in a red accordion folder in the second drawer of the kitchen desk. The Christmas decorations came out on the first Saturday of December and went back into the attic on the second Saturday of January. No exceptions. And anyone who had ever tried to suggest an exception knew from the quality of silence that followed that exceptions were not a category my mother recognized. I was her only child. She had married my father Thomas when she was 29. Thomas Wren was a quiet man who worked in insurance claims and coached Little League on Saturday mornings for 12 years, even after I had aged out and there were no more children in the household who needed a coach. He did it because it gave him a reason to leave the house for an entire Saturday morning. He was a man who needed reasons, specific ones, with timestamps and destinations. I did not understand that about him until I was much older. My mother loved me. I want to say that first and say it clearly, because the rest of this story is complicated, and I do not want the complication to flatten what was real and given without reservation. She packed my lunches until I was in 8th grade, with a handwritten note tucked beneath the sandwich every single day. A different note every time. Good luck on the math test. The weather is supposed to be nice today. Hector is keeping the couch warm for you. She came to every school play. Second row, same seat. Every performance, every year. When I was 12 and broke my wrist falling off a bicycle, she slept in the hospital chair both nights without once complaining about her back, even though I knew it was hurting her because she held it a certain way when she walked, and I had learned her body's grammar the way children learn everything that matters, silently and completely. She taught me to drive in a church parking lot on a Sunday morning. She sat in the passenger seat with her hand flat on the dashboard and her voice very level, telling me when to brake, when to ease off the clutch. When I finally pulled out onto the road without stalling, she exhaled and said, "There you go." Like she had been waiting for exactly that moment, and it had arrived exactly as she predicted. She also told me, when I was 17, that I was not cut out for medical school. I had said it quietly, the thought still new, the kind of idea you float to see where it lands. I want to be a doctor. She had looked at me from across the kitchen table with an expression that was not unkind. She said, "Marin, medical school is for people with a particular kind of drive. You are a thoughtful person. Thoughtful people often do better in roles that don't require that level of competition." She said it the way she labeled the pantry: accurate, organized, final. I did not apply to pre-med programs. She also told me, when I was 23, that moving to Chicago was not practical. I had a friend relocating there, a job lead in a marketing department, an apartment listing with high ceilings and exposed brick, in a neighborhood that felt, from the photos, like the opening frame of a life I hadn't lived yet. My mother sat at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and a printed list of raisins, and she presented them with the calm authority of a woman who had never been wrong about what was best and intended to keep it that way. Cost of living, distance from people who loved me, the instability of a new city with no support structure. I did not have a car that could handle that kind of winter. I had a good thing here. I did not move to Chicago. I took a job at a dental office 12 minutes from her house, answered phones, filed insurance paperwork, managed the schedule. The work was fine. The commute was nothing. My mother seemed relieved in a way that expressed itself as increased warmth, as extra portions at Sunday dinners, as the particular brightness she carried when the household was in the configuration she preferred. That brightness, I understand now, was its own kind of answer to a question I had not yet thought to ask. My father Thomas died in the spring of 2019, pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is the particular cruelty of that disease. No long middle, a beginning, and then almost immediately the end. He went fast. I held one hand and my mother held the other, and neither of us cried until the nurse left the room. After that, it was just us. I moved back into the Cape Cod 2 months later, not because my mother asked, because she did not ask me not to, and I had been trained since childhood to read the space between those two things as instruction. I was 26 years old. I had a box of books, a tabby cat named Hector, and a very specific talent for making myself smaller than I actually was. The illness came in February of 2024. My mother was 67. She had been healthy in that low-drama, stubborn way that comes from routine and iron will, eating the same 5 dinners in rotation, walking the neighborhood every morning at 6:30 regardless of weather, keeping her medical appointments with the same precision she kept everything else. Then she started losing words, small ones first, the name of the street 2 blocks over, the word for the tool in the kitchen drawer that opened cans, then larger ones. Then I found the car keys in the refrigerator between the butter dish and the orange juice on a Sunday morning, and I stood there holding them for a long moment before I said her name. The neurologist was kind and precise. She used the phrase early stage with the particular gentleness of someone who had delivered this news many times and knew that early stage was not a reassurance, but simply the name of the first room in a long corridor. My mother needed a care facility. The good one in town, the one with the south-facing garden and the communal dining room that smelled like real food, had a wait list of 8 months. The second one, also good, but without the garden, had a room available in 6 weeks. My mother read both brochures from her armchair with her reading glasses on, the same way she read contracts and insurance documents and every piece of paper that had ever entered her house. She pointed at the window in the second brochure photograph. She said, "That window looks east." She wanted morning light. The second facility it was. I spent the 6 weeks between packing the house. Packing a house that belongs to someone still living is a different grief than packing after a death. The person is present in every drawer, every labeled folder, the particular arrangement of objects that constitutes a life organized by one specific mind over many decades. And because the person is still living, you cannot decide what to throw away. You box everything and carry it forward and deal with the decision later. Which is, I have come to understand, how most people deal with most things. I packed methodically, room by room, kitchen first, living room second, the downstairs guest room that had been my father's study and still had his pencil cup on the desk, 4 pencils sharpened to the same height because he sharpened them himself every Sunday and liked them even. My mother's closet was last. The box was on the top shelf behind the winter coat. I have already told you what it contained. What I have not told you is what I did in the 5 minutes after I read the adoption decree and the attached letter and the small piece of paper in handwriting I did not yet know. I sat down on the floor of the closet. My mother's shoes were on the rack below the hanging clothes. Navy pumps, black flats, the brown walking shoes she wore on her morning routes. They faced forward, heels aligned, as if standing at attention. I read the document again. Petition for adoption, final decree. The birth certificate attached to it listed 2 names. The mother, Ellen Marie Soto, age 22, nursing student, Allentown, Pennsylvania. The father, unknown. Ellen Marie Soto had been 22 years old when I was born. She had placed me for adoption at 3 weeks of age through a private agency called Harding Family Services, Inc. I had never heard the name Ellen Marie Soto, not once, not in passing, not as a piece of history casually mentioned and quickly moved past. Never. Below the decree was a letter on the agency's letterhead, dated March 1993, addressed to Thomas and Carol Wren, confirming finalization and noting the original birth certificate had been sealed per state law. Below that was the third document. A handwritten note on plain white notepad paper that had gone soft at the fold lines from being opened and refolded many times. The handwriting was careful and unhurried. To whoever reads this, when the time is right, I am leaving this with your parents because I know they will love you. I am not able to keep you, and I am sorry for that every day. My mother wants to find you when you are older, if you are willing. Her name is Ruth Soto. She has left something for you. I hope the life they give you is everything mine couldn't be. I love you already and always. Ellen. I sat in that closet for a long time. The morning light came in under the door. My mother's clothes hung in their row, navy, gray, burgundy, black. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something it had decided required its full attention. Ellen Soto had left something for me. Her mother, Ruth, wanted to find me. I was 31 years old and had been living 12 minutes from this house, and in this house, for the better part of my adult life. A door had been right there the whole time. Someone had decided on my behalf that it should stay closed. I needed to know what was on the other side of it. I want to pause here. If you have ever held something in a closet doorway that rearranged the furniture of your entire understanding, you know what that air felt like. If this story is landing somewhere close to something you carry, drop a comment. Tell me you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. What comes next took me 2 years to fully understand, and I am still understanding it. I did not go to my mother with the box. Not that day, not the day after. The illness had taken enough of her language by then that a direct question would not produce a verifiable answer. Whatever she had done with that box had been decided by the Carol Wren who still had full access to all of her words, and that was the version I needed to understand first. So I researched. I had been, I realized, good at quiet research my entire life, at acquiring information without announcing the acquisition, at moving through a situation without disturbing its surface. It was a skill she had taught me, without meaning to, by making the household a place where surfaces mattered. Ellen Marie Soto had died in 2011. I found the obituary in a digitized archive from an Allentown newspaper. She had been 40 years old. A cardiac event, sudden and complete. She had worked as a registered nurse at a hospital in Bethlehem for 14 years. She had been unmarried. She was survived by her mother, Ruth Soto, then 73. I searched Ruth Soto next. She was 85, living in a retirement community in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. Her name appeared in a 2022 church newsletter, a note about a quilt donated to a silent auction. The newsletter listed a phone number for inquiries. Ruth Soto had a listed phone number in 2024. I sat with that number for 3 days. I wrote it on a Post-it and stuck it inside my bathroom cabinet where my mother could not have seen it even if she visited, which she would not, because she was now in a facility with east-facing windows. I looked at the number every morning while I brushed my teeth. On the morning of the 4th day, I called. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was low and measured, the voice of a woman who had been the steady presence in rooms full of things that might fall apart for a long time. I told her my name, the name from the document, the other one, the name Ellen had chosen before she let me go. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that held something inside it I recognize the way you recognize a piece of music you once knew well and then forgot. I have been waiting for this call for a very long time. I called the state's adoption registry office on a Thursday morning from a back table at a coffee shop on the main street. The woman I spoke with was named Angela, and she had the patient efficiency of someone who had explained the same processes to many people at many different stages of understanding. She confirmed I could request my original birth certificate. She also confirmed something I had not anticipated. There was a contact veto on file for my record. A contact veto, Angela explained, is a document filed by a birth parent or adoptive family that restricts the release of identifying information or direct contact through official state channels. I asked who had filed it. She checked the record. She said the veto was filed by the listed guardian, a Carol Wren, in 2011. I said, in 2011? I was 24 years old. Angela was quiet for a moment, then carefully, yes, that is noted in the file. I sat at the back table of the coffee shop with a cup that had gone cold in front of me and the background sounds of espresso machines and someone at a neighboring table discussing a kitchen renovation in great detail. 2011 was the year Ellen died. The same year she could no longer reach out herself. The same year Ruth would have first tried to make contact through official channels. Someone had filed a legal document in a state registry that year restricting official contact with me, using guardian language that had been inaccurate for 4 years, under the name of a woman who had held no legal guardianship over me since I turned 18 in 2009. Carol Wren had filed the contact veto when I was 24 years old. Ruth's letters, 11 of them, sent between 2011 and 2022 through an intermediary service, had all been addressed to my name at the house on Birchfield Lane, where I had lived during several of those years, and I had received 0 of them. I understood something then, sitting in that coffee shop, something I had to keep understanding in waves over the weeks that followed. My mother had not simply kept a secret. She had maintained the perimeter of that secret with active and deliberate effort. She had filed documents. She had intercepted correspondence. She had made sure, year after year, that the door remained closed. And she had done it while making me Sunday dinners and packing lunches and telling me in a certain voice which version of myself was the practical one. She had held the perimeter with one warm hand and built it with the other. Ruth mentioned Gerald Hatch near the end of our first phone call, in the tone of someone raising a subject they have been carrying alone for a long time and need to finally set down. She said, Ellen set up a trust for you when she was 25. She had a small life insurance policy, and she named you as the beneficiary. Gerald Hatch was her attorney. He was supposed to contact you when you turned 21. I turned 21 in 2014. Gerald Hatch had done his job. He had written to the address on file with Harding Family Services, the only address he had for the named beneficiary of the Ellen Soto Trust, the house on Birchfield Lane. Follow-up letters followed in 2015 and 2016. After 5 years of no response, the trust's terms required Gerald to report the funds to the Pennsylvania Treasury as unclaimed property. In 2019, the Ellen Soto Trust was reported as unclaimed property belonging to an heir of record, listed under my birth name. The name on the sealed certificate. The name I did not know I had. Not under Maren Wren. Under the other one. The principal was $47,000. With 11 years of interest accrued during its unclaimed status, it had grown to approximately $62,000. Ellen had saved that money on a nursing student's salary. She had done it at 25 years old, 3 years after she had placed me, when enough time had passed for the decision to be permanent and for the love to also be permanent. She had wanted me to have something from her, something concrete and lasting, something she could send forward through time and circumstance, even if she could not send herself. I had been 12 minutes from Birchfield Lane for years, living in the house where the letters arrived, receiving none of them. I want to stop here again, and I want to ask you directly, if you have ever been loved by someone who needed you to stay small in order to feel certain you would stay at all, if you have ever had your ambitions labeled not practical and filed away like something that needed organizing, drop a comment. I read every one. If there is a sealed version of yourself that has never been given a room, stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't, because what comes next is the part where things actually move. Patricia Lim had an office above a bakery on the main street. I had driven past that office for years. There was always a lemon cake in the window display that I had never ordered and always noticed. The way you notice things you have decided without deciding are not for you. Her waiting room had 2 chairs and a plant that was doing considerably better than most plants in professional offices, which I took as a promising sign about her attention to what was in her care. She read everything I placed in front of her. The adoption decree, the correspondence from Gerald Hatch, faxed to me within 48 hours of my call, a man who had been waiting 11 years to resolve what he had understood from the beginning as a missing person problem of the administrative kind, the documentation of the contact veto, Ruth's folder of letters labeled for Maren in careful chronological order, 11 envelopes with the return address of an intermediary service, all of them addressed to me at Birchfield Lane. None of them opened, not by me, possibly not by anyone. She read without interrupting. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at me over the top of her glasses. She said, "The unclaimed property claim is straightforward. Proof of identity, DNA confirmation, trust instruments, original birth certificate unsealed upon formal request. The state's Unclaimed Property Bureau has a formal claim process. The funds plus accrued interest are yours. That part is relatively clean." I said, "The contact veto?" She said, "A contact veto filed using inaccurate guardian status is challengeable. The filing was made in 2011. You were 24 years old in 2011. Your adoptive mother had no legal guardianship over you at that time and had not since your 18th birthday in 2009. The filing used language implying ongoing guardianship over a minor. The registry accepted the filing without verification." She picked up her pen. "The veto can be revoked on the record through the registry's correction process. Whether the filing itself rises to fraudulent misrepresentation in a legal proceeding is a question that requires more examination, but the correction of the record is achievable." I said, "I'm not looking to prosecute my mother." Patricia said, "I understand. The correction is not about prosecution. It's about the record being accurate." She paused. There is one other thing worth examining. She touched the folder of Ruth's letters. These were addressed to you at a residence where you were living during several of those years, between 2022 and 2024 in particular. There is a distinction between failing to forward mail, for which there is generally no specific legal obligation between family members, and the active withholding of correspondence someone knows to be intended for you and in your clear interest to receive. She looked at me. I would want to review whether any of these letters were opened and not returned. That question has different implications. I looked out her window. The lemon cake was in the display shelf below. A woman on the sidewalk had stopped and was considering it, hand raised to the glass. I thought about Ellen at 25, setting aside money from a nursing student's salary so that I would have something from her. I thought about Ruth labeling a folder for Marin and adding to it for 11 years. I thought about the state database sitting quietly under a name I had never been given permission to use. I said, "Let's begin with the unclaimed property claim and the veto correction." Patricia wrote without looking up. The DNA results came back in 11 days. The connection to the Soto family was definitive. I called Ruth when they arrived. She said, "Good." The way she said most things, complete and clean, like a door closing on a room that no longer needed to be open. I drove to Doylestown on a Saturday in April. Ruth's retirement community looked like a hotel designed by someone who had read extensively about comfort without spending much time in places that were actually warm. The lobby had a piano no one was playing and fresh flowers on a table that had clearly been arranged on a schedule. Ruth met me in the lobby. She walked without a cane, slowly but without hesitation, the walk of a woman who had decided to remain and was keeping her side of the arrangement. She was 85 years old, and she wore a gray-blue cardigan, and she looked at my face when I came through the sliding doors, and she stood completely still for a moment. She said, "You have her hands." We sat in a small sitting room. She had brought a photograph in a soft plastic sleeve. Ellen, at approximately 30, in nursing scrubs, outside a hospital entrance, squinting into the sun, laughing at whoever held the camera. She had dark hair and a narrow jaw, and a laugh that reached her eyes, even in a photograph from 25 years ago. I held the photograph for a long time. Ruth told me things that I have carried with me every day since that afternoon. Ellen had been stubborn in the way that makes people frustrated with you and is also the reason things get done. She had been the person in every room who noticed the small, wrong thing first, who named it before anyone else reached it. She had worked 2 jobs to pay her way through nursing school, a diner on weekday mornings and a grocery stock shift on weekend nights, and had graduated in the top 5th of her class. She had decided at 7 years old that she would be a nurse and had not once reconsidered. She had never fully forgiven herself for the adoption. Not because it had been the wrong decision, Ruth said, but because some weights do not require a wrong decision to be heavy. She had placed me, believing I would be loved. She had been correct. She had carried the weight of it every day until the cardiac event at 40 that ended the carrying. I said, "I was loved. I want you to know that." Ruth looked at me for a moment. She said, "I know. That was the only reason I could stand not being able to reach you. I told myself every year that you were loved." She reached into her cardigan pocket and brought out a second photograph, this one older, Colors faded at the edges. A baby in a yellow blanket, eyes closed, face carrying the particular expression of someone who has just arrived and has not yet made any decisions about what to make of the place. Ruth said, "That is you." Ellen took that photograph the morning before she signed the papers. She told me she needed one thing she could keep. I did not cry in that room. I cried in the parking lot, engine running, windows up, for 4 minutes by the clock on the dashboard. Then I stopped. Then I drove home. Some things do not arrive all at once. They arrive the way seasons change, slowly and then entirely. And one morning, you look up and the landscape is different from the one you have been living in for years. I brought tulips to my mother on a Thursday, yellow ones. She had grown them in the side garden every spring since I could remember, in 3 rows, yellow and red alternating. 2 colors, she always said, because one color looks like a decision and 2 colors look like an argument. And she preferred the argument because it was more honest. She was in her chair by the east window when I arrived. The morning light was on her. She looked present in a way she sometimes did not anymore. I sat down across from her. I put the tulips on the small table between us. I said, "Mom, I found the box." She looked at the tulips. She looked at me. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. The expression of a woman who has been carrying a particular weight for 31 years and has just heard it set down. She said, "Oh." I said, "I know about Ellen. I know about Ruth. I know about the letters." She looked at the window. The light came through it slowly, the way light moves in a room facing east, patient and unhurried, in no particular rush to get anywhere. I said, "I'm not here to fight. I think you were afraid from the beginning that someone would come and take me back, and I want you to know that was never going to happen. I was yours. I have always been yours. That didn't need to be a secret for 31 years. She worked towards something then. I could see it. The effort of finding the words in the places where some of them had relocated without her permission. She said, "I didn't want you to go." Then, after a pause long enough to hold a whole room inside it, she said, "She was young." I said, "She was very young, and she loved me, and she left something for me, and I didn't get to receive it until now, but I received it." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Her hand was warm. It had always been warm. When I was small and the nights were bad, she would come and sit on the edge of my bed and put that warm hand on my forehead, and the warmth was enough to make the dark feel contained and safe, which is the specific magic that belongs to the people who raise us. I held her hand. I did not say contact veto. I did not say fraudulent misrepresentation. I did not say 11 letters over 11 years returned unopened or not returned at all. Not in that room, not in that particular light, not to that hand. Some truths belong in legal filings and registry corrections and formal documentation of record. Some truths belong in a closet floor at 10 in the morning, between a row of shoes and a coat that still smells like powder. And some truths belong only in a moment between 2 people, held without ceremony in a room facing east. I stayed for an hour. When I left, she was watching the window. Patricia filed the unclaimed property claim in May. The process was slow and methodical. which is the only pace at which systems built for fairness can function. Proof of identity. DNA results. Original birth certificate unsealed upon formal application. My birth name printed at the top. Ellen's name below it. Trust documentation from Gerald Hatch, who had been waiting 11 years with the professional patience of a man who understood that some inheritances arrive late through no fault of the person who was always supposed to receive them. The contact veto correction was filed in June. The state registry amended the record, noting the original filing's procedural inaccuracy. The veto was reclassified as improperly filed. The record now said what had always been true. I had been a legal adult. No guardian was authorized to file on my behalf. The trust funds cleared in August, $62,000 and 11 years of interest, transferred to an account I opened specifically for this money, separate from anything else I owned. It had its own origin. It needed its own place. I called Ruth when the confirmation email arrived. She said, "Good," the way she said most things. I said, "I'm going to take a trip. I've never seen the Pacific Coast." Ruth said, "Ellen always wanted to go to Oregon." I said, "Then that's where I'm going." She said, "Take a photograph." I said, "I'll take one for both of us." I gave notice at the dental office in September. I want to be honest that I had no fully formed plan. What I had was a savings account, more funded than it had been, a newly specific understanding of what 31 years of staying 12 minutes away had cost in terms of a life not yet lived, and a very clear knowledge that I was capable of more than I had been permitted to demonstrate. I had known this since I was 17, sitting across a kitchen table from a woman with a printed list of reasons why I was the thoughtful kind rather than the driven kind, and was better suited to a role that did not require that level of competition. I enrolled in a post-baccalaureate pre-med program at a university 40 minutes north. It was a program built specifically for people who had arrived at the right door decades later than expected, for students who had taken detours through other people's needs and other people's fears and were now quietly looking up directions. The application required a personal essay. I wrote about Ellen. I wrote about Ruth. I wrote about a woman who spent 31 years becoming the version of herself most convenient for the house she was living in. About what that cost. About a fireproof box on a closet shelf and what was inside it. And what it meant that it had been kept there rather than opened. And what it meant that it had been kept at all. The admissions committee sent a letter in December, an acceptance. I did not call my mother about the admission, not from anger. The anger, when it came in waves and receded the way grief does, leaving the shore a little different each time. What I had most days was not anger. It was something more like a precise, flat sorrow for the apartment in Chicago and the medical school application that was never written, and the 11 letters that arrived at a house where I was living and never reached my hands. On those days, I ran. I came home and fed Hector and opened the Pathophysiology textbook on my desk and read until the sorrow was smaller than the material in front of me. That was enough. Most days, it was enough. I want to stop here and say something to you directly. If you have ever been loved in a way that was also a kind of diminishment, if you have ever had a person who would do anything for you as long as that anything fit inside the shape of who they needed you to be, If you have ever spent years becoming more practical, more 12 minutes away, more the version of yourself whose ambitions got organized into a folder and filed on a shelf, you are not alone in that house. I am not asking you to be angry. I am not asking you to forgive either. I am saying this: the box was on the shelf the whole time. Whatever is sealed in your particular container, whatever name is on the envelope, whatever has been kept from you by someone who loved you with the wrong kind of grip, it exists. It is real. And when the shelf is finally cleared, you will find it. You were always entitled to open it. Drop a comment if you are here. Tell me what you are carrying. And subscribe, because what comes next is the part I think about on ordinary mornings more than any other. Ruth came to the graduation ceremony in May. She drove herself to the campus 40 minutes north and arrived in the auditorium 15 minutes before doors opened, which I had come to understand was simply how Ruth operated. She sat in the third row in a gray-blue cardigan with her purse in her lap, and she watched the whole thing. I found her in the audience before I found anyone else. The way you find the thing you have been looking for, even in a room full of other things. After the ceremony, we sat on a bench outside in the warm May afternoon. She had brought a photograph. She always brought one, rationing them the way you ration something precious that you still have enough of. This one was Ellen in nursing school, first year, in clinical whites, holding a thick textbook and laughing at the camera. 20 years old, already decided. Ruth held it out between us and said, "She would have liked this. She would have said something funny about it that I would have pretended wasn't funny." I laughed. The laugh came up fast and real, the way real laughter does. I thought about a concept I had learned that semester in pharmacology: bioavailability. The percentage of a compound that reaches its intended target after traveling through a biological system. Some things arrive intact. Some are intercepted, altered, rerouted. The question is always what percentage gets through. Ellen Soto had sent something across time and sealed birth certificates and contact vetoes and unclaimed property databases toward a person she had let go before she knew who that person would become. The compound had been intercepted, held in a fireproof box, held in a state registry under a name I was not permitted to know, held in 11 envelopes on a shelf for 11 years. But the bioavailability had not been zero. $62,000 and a name and 11 letters and a woman in a gray-blue cardigan who drove herself to ceremonies and arrived before the doors opened. It had arrived. All of it, eventually, had arrived. Ruth folded the photograph carefully and tucked it into her purse. She said, "Your great-grandmother's name was Alma, my mother. She died before Ellen was born." A pause. "You have her jaw." 3 generations of a jaw that passed through women who kept going, who loved forward through circumstances that did not cooperate, who left things in boxes and trusts and labeled folders for the person who would eventually need to find them. I am 32 years old. I start medical school in August. I have a cat named Hector, who has no opinion about any of this and sleeps in the same spot on the couch regardless of what I discover about myself. I have a biological grandmother named Ruth who drives herself to ceremonies and arrives early and brings 1 photograph per visit and has a sense of humor she does not always show you. I have a mother in a facility on Birchfield Lane with warm hands and east-facing windows who labeled everything in her house, including a combination lock on a fireproof box, and who chose my birthday as the combination, not because she ever planned to give it to me, but because some part of her could not choose anything else. I have a name Ellen gave me before she let me go. I use it sometimes, in forms I fill out for myself alone, in documents that belong only to me, in the quiet space between who I have been and who I am becoming. Not because the other name was wrong, but because both names are true, and I am entitled to all of what is true about me. The box was fireproof, which means my mother understood when she placed it there and set the combination and pushed it to the back of the highest shelf behind the coat she could not bring herself to throw away, that what was inside it mattered, that it was worth protecting from fire. She just didn't understand until the very last possible moment that what was inside it was not hers to protect. It was mine to find. If this story reached you today, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Tell me what it unlocked. Tell me if you have a name you have never used, a door you have never been shown, a version of yourself that has been waiting on a shelf behind something that still smells like someone else. And if you know someone sitting in a house full of sealed boxes, share this video with them. There are more stories on this channel. The link is in the description. Thank you for listening. I mean that.